Good morning, students. Today, I would like to discuss about MVC architecture, which is available in fourth unit. What is the objectives of today's lecture are to understand the concept of MVC and outline the advantages of using MVC architecture for developing web applications. So, I would like to introduce what is the need of MVC with these examples. Suppose you take a television. So television is providing some user interface through which you can select the required channels and you can view the programs in this particular television. For that, we are provided a user interface, that is a menu. We have provided that, and certain buttons are provided through which you can select the channel of your choice. So using this interface, you can select the channel. For example, you want a CNN channel to view. Then you will select that channel on the user interface. Then that request will goes to the internal mechanism. So that internal mechanism is nothing but your circuit system and everything what we have internal to the television. Now this internal mechanism will send the request to the source, that is what we are calling it as here dish antenna. Now the data or the channel what you require, is it accessible or that particular frequency is available in the source or not, it will check, and if it is available, then that particular channel will be provided as a response to this mechanism. Now this mechanism, that is the internal parts or the circuitry of this television, is rendering that response about that requested channel, and that particular channel and the program which is currently running will be displayed onto the television screen. So this is the mechanism how a user will select a particular channel in the television, and once the user selects, the user will get the response. So that means here a request will goes through internal mechanism to the source, and from that particular source the response comes to the internal mechanism, and that internal mechanism will render that response to the user desired format onto this user interface or onto this screen. I hope you got the point here, how the request will goes and how the response will be get displayed. Now take another example. So this is what we are calling it as, you are using some web browser, and within the web browser you are typing some request, that is you are typing as a address, you want the data pertaining to the different laptops. So that search string you have typed in the web browser. Once you typed that request, it will goes to this mechanism. Now this mechanism will receive that request from the user, and that request will be sent to the database or a web server. Now within this database or the web server, it will fetch the data required for the user. That is nothing but the user requires the data pertaining to laptops. So from this server or the database, we will get the data pertaining to the laptops to this particular controller. That is what we are calling it as internal mechanism. And that response will be rendered onto the laptop screen in the desired format for the end user. So the information pertaining to the laptops, that information is required such that we want to display the laptop image followed by its configuration and so on. Like this, you want to render the, or you want to display that response retrieved from that web server or the database onto the user screen, that is onto the monitor. So this is what generally when we are giving the request by typing in the address bar, and that request will goes to some internal mechanism to the web server, and the web server or the database will have large amounts of data stored in it, and the request what we have sent to the database, satisfying that particular request, the database or the web server will provide the response to the internal mechanism, and this internal mechanism will render that response in the user required format onto the screen. Got the point here? So we are giving the request, that request will pass through some internal mechanism to the source where the actual data is available. From that source we are fetching the data, and that data will be fetched by internal mechanism, and that internal mechanism will renders that required data in the desired form. It will be displayed onto the output screen. Fine. Now this is what we are calling it as user interface, where you are giving the request and where we are displaying the response. That is called it as the user interface, and this user interface is generally called it as the view. Generally the view will be developed either in a HTML page or by using JSP. We can develop this user interface. Now coming to this internal mechanism, which will take the request from the user interface and forward that request to the respective database or the web server or to the respective file system, and it retrieves the data from that database or the file system, and it will formulate the response required by the user in the desired format, and it will be rendered to that user interface. These things will be done, that is what we are calling it as a controlling of requests from the user, and sending of the responses to the user will be done by this controller. This is what we are calling it as a controller. This mechanism we are calling it as a controller. Generally this controller will be implemented through servlets. Servlet is another technology available in the Java. So this controller or the internal mechanism is implemented through servlet technology. And coming to this, the source or the destination where we are storing the data, which is what we are calling it as a database or the file system or a web server. So where you are implementing your business logic pertaining to your application domain, you are implementing your business logic in terms of different objects. For example, you take a database, you are storing the data in the tables, isn't it? So like this here, you are storing the data in this database. That is what we are calling it as a model. We are calling it as. In the model, we are implementing the business logic. We are implementing that. What the point here? So view is nothing but user interface. So view is implemented by making use of JSP or HTML technology, and this controller is implemented, that is the internal mechanism is implemented through servlet technology, and this model is implemented through databases or web servers. Okay, like example, Tomcat is a web server, BA WebLogic is also a web server. Like that, we have the web servers where you are implementing your business logic by writing Java POSO objects. Generally, we call it as plain old Java objects, POJO, POSO objects. In terms of POSO objects, we will implement this business logic, and that is what we are calling it as a model. Got the point here? So this is what MVC. M stands for model, V stands for view, and C stands for controller. So model view controller architecture. So this type of architecture is followed by most of the web applications or the web programming. What we are doing, these MVC architecture is generally or mostly followed for developing of these web application softwares. Now coming to this, in this particular slide, just I want to describe what is MVC. Just now I told that MVC is one of the mostly used design pattern in the web programming or in web application development nowadays. MVC architecture was initially included in two major web application development frameworks, that is Struts and Ruby on Rails. These are two different types of web application development frameworks, Struts and Ruby on Rails. These are the first web application frameworks which introduced this MVC architecture. MVC architecture will separate the application logic from the user interface when designing the software. This point is very important. The MVC architecture is separating the application logic from the user interface when we are designing any software application. So as the name implies that MVC pattern has three layers. Just now we have seen the three layers are model, which represents the business layer of the application. That is, the business logic is implemented in the model layer. And then second one is view. This view layer defines the presentation layer of the application. So presentation layer means how the user can see the output or the response. So that is what we are calling it as view. That is a presentation layer, we can say it as. Then coming to the third layer, which is called as a controller. This controller layer will manages the flow of data in the application. Just now in the previous examples, we have seen that this controller, so this controller is controlling the flow of data from view to the model and from model to the view. So this is just like a traffic police, how he controls the traffic at the junctions. Similar to that, here the controller will control the data flow within the entire application between the view and the model via the controller. So model, view, controller architecture or the design pattern. So model represent the business layer, your business logic, that is the application logic will be implemented in the model, and in terms of databases or files, or in terms of POSO objects, plain old Java objects, POSO objects, we will implement as a model. View is nothing but the presentation layer, and the third one is the controller layer, which is called it as a controller which controls or manages the flow of data. Now, how MVC will works actually? Just now in the previous slides, I shown how the request from the user will be forwarded to the destination and how we will receive the response. So same thing here, it will go through these three layers: model, view, controller. Now you see here, I have taken these three layers. This is a model layer, so where your business logic will be implemented. This is the controller layer, which is nothing but it is implemented through a servlet, and this is the view layer. We will implement this is called it as a presentation layer, which is nothing but it will be implemented through HTML or JSP, Java Server Pages. JSP stands for Java Server Pages. Now, how the user will give a request and get the response. Generally, to send the request, the user will uses the browser, web browser. Web browsers are nothing but Internet Explorer or Mozilla Firefox or Google Chrome. Like that, he will use the web browser, and in the web browser address bar, he will type the address, that is URL, what the page he requires. That is nothing but we are calling it as a request. The first step is by using the browser on the client side or the end user side, he or she will send a request for a page to the controller layer. That request will comes to the controller layer. Now the controller layer performs the action of invoking the model. So and so user requires some data, get that data, that request will be forwarded to the model layer. So we want to gather the data and updates, whatever the updates you want to perform in the databases, that you can do the updates here and you can gather the data. That is what the second step is. The controller performs the action of invoking the model, thereby retrieving the data it needs in response to the request. Then the third step is the controller then gives the retrieved data to the view. That is nothing but we are calling it as it renders the data to the view. That is a presentation layer. Now the presentation layer is form the data what it is received from the controller in the user required form, whether the user want to display the data in the tabular form or whether the user wanted to display the data by making use of some images, that is pictures, like that. So the view what we are using here, based on that view the retrieved data from the controller will be presented by this presentation layer or the view layer. Next, fourth step is the view layer is renders and send back the data, or what we are calling it as a response, to the browser, so that that response will be displayed on the client browser or client window. So this is how MVC will works. So using browser, client will send a request to the controller. Controller will retrieves or get the data from the model or update the data in the model. And once the data controller receives corresponding that request, then it will render that response to the view layer, presentation layer, and that view will be sent as a result or response back to the web browser so that it will be displayed. This is how MVC works. Now, what is MVC architecture in Java? So in the Java programming context, the model consists of simple Java classes. The model consisting of simple Java classes. Just now I told POSO objects, plain old Java objects. They may be stored in the database basically. And the view displays the data, and the controller consists of servlets. So using MVC, we are trying to separate, the business logic or the application logic from the presentation logic. So this separation results in user requests being processed as explained in the previous slide. Now the architecture, if you see that, so we can represent that four steps which we have seen in this slide. These four steps I can represent in a diagrammatic way so that I can get the architecture for MVC. So the architecture is like this. So the user will make use of web browser to give a request, and the request will goes to the controller. Controller is nothing but the servlet, and servlet will ask the model to give the data, and the model will provide the data to the controller. This is providing, we are getting the response to the controller back, and that data or the response will be forwarded to the view, which is implemented in the form of either a JSP page or an HTML page, and that view will be again displayed onto the web browser. So this is what we are calling it as architecture of model view controller, MVC architecture. Then next, coming to this, by separating this application into three distinct components like model, view, and controller, and this separation will give you lot of advantages while we are developing the software applications. Next, we are going to discuss about what are the advantages of using this architecture. The advantages are as follows. Because we are separating the application development such that the model will be designed separately, presentation, that is view, will be designed separately, and the controller will be designed separately. Since we have separating these tasks, so multiple developers can work with three layers simultaneously. Few developers can work in developing model and in developing view. Similarly, one or more developers can work on developing the controller. So multiple developers can work with these three layers simultaneously. This is the first advantage of using MVC architecture. Next, coming to this, it improves the scalability. MVC architecture, if you are following for developing a web application, Then the web application development improved its scalability so that it supplements the ability of the application to grow. And third advantage is that as components have a low dependency on each other, they are easy to maintain because we are developing three components separately here, low dependency. Fourth advantage is that a model can be reused by multiple views, which provides the reusability of code. So because we have only one model, that is one database or one file system or one web server we have here, that we are able to share by multiple views. So reusability of the code. Then here adoption of MVC makes an application more expressive and easy to understand. And another advantage is that extending and testing of the application becomes easy. You can easily extend, you can add new components easily, either to the model or to a view or to a controller. So it is easy for extending that component if you desire. And also the testing of the application also becomes simple because independent components here, whatever the component you want to test, you can test it independently. So enhancing and testing of this application becomes easy. These are the different advantages we can get if you are using MVC architecture for developing the software applications. Okay, so I hope you understood what is the MVC architecture and what are the advantages you will get through this MVC architecture if you are able to follow this architecture by making use of Java applications. If you have any doubts, please post the doubts in our group. Thank you. Thank you, one and all.